I stood beside my wife believing love meant silence always. I had been Ethan Walker, husband, supporter, shadow, never equal partner. Lauren Mitchell smiled for cameras, never once looking at me. She squeezed my arm and whispered, "Stay quiet tonight, Ethan." I nodded because I always nodded when she commanded softly. The gala lights burned while executives laughed and praised her. Someone asked Lauren who I was, standing beside her confidently. She laughed lightly and said, "Just my husband, nothing important." My chest tightened, but I forced a polite practice smile. Ryan Cole stepped forward holding champagne, wearing familiarity comfortably. Lauren's eyes softened instantly, something I had not seen years. Ryan said, "Lauren, you look incredible, running everything flawlessly tonight." She touched his arm and replied, "I learned from loving you." I stared at them, feeling invisible, erased, standing inches away. A reporter asked about rumors of Ryan returning professionally tonight. Lauren said, "Yes, he inspires me, reminds me who I was." I asked quietly, "Lauren, can we talk for a second, please?" She frowned and said, "Not now, Ethan, stop embarrassing me." Ryan smirked and said, "Relax, man, she means business focus." I swallowed anger and said, "I am her husband, remember." Lauren turned cold and said, "Titles do not equal value, Ethan." Executives chuckled awkwardly, pretending nothing serious was happening. I asked, "What am I then, after everything I sacrificed?" She said, "Replaceable, people come and go, growth matters more." Those words sliced deeper than shouting ever could publicly. Ryan raised his glass and said, "To second chances and progress." Lauren clinked glasses with him, ignoring my shaking hands. I said quietly, "I gave up my career for you." She replied, "Nobody asked you to be small, Ethan." I remembered late nights, encouraging her dreams, cooking alone, waiting. I remembered signing papers, trusting love more than protection. A reporter asked Ethan, "How do you feel supporting Lauren?" Lauren answered for me, saying he enjoys staying behind scenes. I laughed once sharp and asked, "Do I look happy?" She hissed, "Stop this now or leave immediately." Ryan leaned close and said, "No, when you lose, buddy." My ears rang as applause erupted for Lauren's speech. She spoke about loyalty, innovation, and courage without looking once. I clapped mechanically, feeling like a stranger wearing my face. When speech ended, she accepted praise, hugs, photos without me. I followed, asking Lauren, "Please just talk to me." She said, "Go home, Ethan, you are ruining everything." I asked, "Is there still us? Answer me honestly." She paused, then said, "There was never just us." Those words echoed louder than music flooding the hall. I stepped back, realizing everyone was watching, quietly judging. Ryan avoided my eyes, victory written across his posture. Lauren turned away, already moving toward cameras and power. I stood alone, holding a useless smile and empty ring. My phone buzzed with messages I could not read. I realized love without respect becomes slow public execution. I whispered to myself, "This marriage died tonight completely." The crowd moved around me like water around stone. I felt exposed, small, and finally awake, painfully aware. I walked toward exit, hearing laughter echo behind me. Each step felt heavier, yet strangely clearer than before. Outside, air hit cold, while applause faded into nothing. I said goodbye silently to the man I used to be. I drove home in silence, with Lauren staring through the window. Inside the house, I asked, "Can we talk now, please?" She dropped her heels and said, "You embarrassed me tonight." I said, "You humiliated me first in front of everyone." She laughed and said, "You are too sensitive, Ethan." I asked why Ryan mattered more than me suddenly. She said, "He always mattered, you just filled space." I felt my chest tighten and said, "I built this life." She replied, "You followed me like a shadow, not a leader." I asked, "What about the years I supported you?" She snapped, "I carried us, you just watched." I said, "I quit my job for your startup, remember?" She said, "I never forced you to be weak." I said, "I signed everything under your name, trusting you." She said, "Smart men protect themselves, foolish men trust love." My phone buzzed and Daniel texted, "Are you okay?" I typed, "Not really, call me later, please." Lauren crossed her arms and said, "Stop playing victim." I said, "I believed marriage meant partnership." She replied, "Marriage means growth, and you stopped growing." I asked, "Did you ever love me honestly?" She hesitated, then said, "I loved stability, not you." Those words landed heavier than shouting ever could. I said, what about our vows and promises? She said, vows change, people change, feelings die. The door opened and Megan walked in holding files. She froze and said, oh, bad timing, sorry, Lauren. Lauren said, stay, Megan, he already knows. Megan glanced at me and said, the board agrees. I asked, agrees with what exactly? Lauren said, separating personal from professional risks. Megan said, Ryan understands the vision better. I looked at Lauren and said, you plan this. She said, I plan my future, not your feelings. Megan shifted awkwardly and said, I will wait outside. After she left, I asked, when did I lose you? Lauren said, you never had me fully, Ethan. I remembered nights, cooking alone, waiting for her calls. I remembered cheering her wins while hiding my losses. I said, I gave up my dreams for you. She said, dreams die when people are afraid. I asked, is Ryan the reason you changed? She said, he is my true love. That sentence broke something final inside me. I whispered, then why marry me at all? She said, you were safe, predictable, convenient. My hands shook as I asked, what happens now? She said, we need a temporary separation. I said, temporary sounds permanent when said coldly. She replied, do not dramatize this. I said, where do I go tonight? She said, stay with a friend, figured out. Daniel called, and I answered saying she wants separation. He said, I warned you, she was using you. Lauren rolled her eyes and said, stop poisoning him. Daniel said, Ethan, you deserve respect, not leftovers. I looked at Lauren, searching for regret. She looked bored, already emotionally gone. I ended the call and said I loved alone. She did not deny it or apologize. She walked upstairs, leaving me standing there hollow. I sat on the couch, realizing my marriage ended quietly. I stood and followed upstairs, asking, are you sure about this? She said, certainty is the only thing I have left. I said, we can fix this if you try. She said, I am done trying with you. I asked, when should I come back? She said, do not rush, take time, think. I said, you already decided without me. She said, leaders decide alone sometimes. I went to the bedroom and packed, slowly, shaking. She watched and said, do not make a scene. I said, you already did publicly, remember? She said, that was necessary for respect. I laughed bitterly and said, respect without love is empty. She said, love without ambition is useless. I asked, do you feel nothing at all? She paused and said, I feel relief. Those words confirmed what my heart feared. I carried my bag downstairs, feeling smaller. At the door, I turned and said, I believed in us. She replied, belief does not pay emotional debt. I asked, will you miss me even slightly? She said, I will miss the quiet. I nodded, understanding my role finally clearly. I stepped outside, realizing I fought alone always. I whispered goodbye to a life built on denial. The door closed softly, like a final verdict. I stood in the dark, knowing separation meant execution, without any mercy. The lawyer slid the envelope across the table and said, please sign here. I stared and asked, these are divorce papers already. He said, Mrs. Mitchell prefers efficiency over discussion. I laughed once and said, that sounds like her voice. I signed slowly, feeling like an asset written off. Outside the building, I muttered, I was never valued. I stepped forward, distracted, and bumped into someone sharply. She said, watch where you're going, sir. I said, I am sorry, my head is not clear. She looked at the papers and asked, rough day. I said, my wife just fired me for marriage. She paused, then said, honesty beats pity, thank you. I looked up, noticing her calm, distant eyes. She said, I am Victoria Hale. I said, Ethan Walker, formerly someone important. She said, important shifts depending on leverage. I asked, do you always speak like contracts? She said, emotions cost too much these days. I laughed softly and said, I agree today. She asked, do you need help or silence? I said, silence feels safer right now. She nodded and said, good choice. We stood awkwardly until she said goodbye. I walked away, strangely lighter than before. At home, I tried logging into my bank. The screen flashed access denied repeatedly. I called the bank and asked what happened. They said accounts are frozen by court request. I whispered, Lauren, you planned everything. I logged into the company portal next. My name was gone, like I never existed. I slammed the desk and said I was erased. Daniel called and said, you sound broken. I said she took everything legally and quietly. He said, I warned you months ago, Ethan. I said, I believed love mattered more than contracts. He replied, belief without protection is surrender. I asked, what do I do now? He said, stand up or disappear completely. A knock came and I opened the door. Victoria stood there holding a file calmly. She said, you dropped this earlier. I said, thank you, you did not have to come. She said, I dislike unfinished interactions. I invited her in, awkwardly apologizing for mess. She said, wealth does not equal comfort, trust me. I asked, why did you really return? She said, our meeting felt honest, rare these days. I said, honesty got me divorced apparently. She said, honesty exposes weak structures. I asked, are you always this blunt? She said, only when truth saves time. She glanced around and said, she stripped you clean. I nodded and said she always was efficient. Victoria said, my family pressures me constantly too. I asked, pressure for what exactly? She said, marriage alliances, power, protection, optics. I laughed bitterly and said, love, never mentioned. She said, love complicates negotiations. I said, I once believed love was enough. She replied, belief is dangerous without leverage. Daniel texted asking, who is with you? I replied, someone unexpectedly kind. Victoria stood and said, I will be direct. She said, you need stability, protection, and name. I said, that sounds like business again. She said, everything is business eventually. I asked, what are you suggesting exactly? She said, a partnership mutually beneficial. I stared and asked, marriage. She said, yes, contractual, public controlled. I laughed shocked and said, you barely know me. She said, I know you were loyal and discarded. I asked, why choose me? She said, broken men value boundaries. I asked, is this about revenge? She said, it is about survival and balance. I paced and said, this is insane. She said, insanity is trusting without safeguards. I remembered Lauren's cold smile suddenly. I said, I need time to think. Victoria said, take one night only. She walked to the door and said, decide tomorrow. She paused and added, I do not offer twice. The door closed, leaving silence and possibility. I met Victoria the next evening inside a quiet private office. She said, read everything carefully before agreeing. I said, I already know the price of trust. She slid the contract forward and said, public marriage, private boundaries. I asked, no love, no expectations, no emotions involved. She nodded and said, emotions complicate control. I signed slowly and said, I accept the terms. She said, welcome to a strategic alliance, Ethan. We married quietly days later with witnesses, lawyers, silence. No vows, just signatures, cameras, and measured smiles. I moved into her estate feeling like borrowed furniture. She said, this house runs on rules, respect privacy. I said, I can follow rules. I lived by silence. She paused, then said, do not compare me to her. I said, I meant no offense, just honesty. She said, honesty is acceptable, drama is not. At dinner, her grandfather, Henry Hale, joined us. He stared and said, you understand your position, boy. I said, I understand this is not romance. Henry said, good feelings weaken empires. Victoria said, he knows the boundaries, grandfather. Henry nodded and said, learn quickly or drown. Later, Claire Monroe appeared at a board meeting. She smiled and said, interesting choice, Victoria. I said, interesting times create bold decisions. Claire said, husbands can be liabilities. I replied, only if underestimated. Victoria watched quietly, approving nothing openly. That night, Lauren called, screaming through the phone. She said, how dare you marry so fast? I said, you asked for separation, remember? She shouted, you betrayed me publicly. I laughed bitterly and said, irony suits you. She said, you married for revenge. I said, I married for survival. She said, you will regret this choice. I said, I regretted trusting you more. She hung up, leaving silence behind. Victoria asked, does she always shout like that? I said, power feels loud when slipping away. She said, detach emotionally or this fails. I nodded, understanding the warning clearly. Days passed, filled with meetings, lessons, and observation. I asked questions instead of shrinking quietly. Victoria noticed and said, you adapt quickly. I said, pain teaches efficiency. She said, do not confuse growth with revenge. I said, I seek balance, not payback. She studied me and said, you surprise me. At another meeting, Claire challenged my input sharply. I responded calmly, citing numbers and strategy. Henry later said, you are not useless. I took that as praise here. Victoria said, confidence suits you better than apology. I said, confidence feels earned finally. One night, I asked why choose marriage at all. She said, because trust is unreliable, contracts endure. Asked, do you believe in love? She said, belief is irrelevant, outcomes matter. I said, outcomes sometimes follow emotion. She said, emotions destroyed you once. I said, they also taught me limits. She looked away, uncomfortable briefly. I realized her walls hid old wounds. Lauren sent messages apologizing, accusing, pleading alternately. I did not reply, choosing silence for once. Victoria said, detachment is power, Ethan. I said, power feels quieter than I expected. She said, real power never needs noise. Weeks later, tabloids praised our alliance strength. Lauren's company stock dipped amid rumors. I felt nothing, only distance. I stood on the balcony beside Victoria. She said, you regret this choice. I said, no, I chose this life. She said, this marriage will change you. I said, it already has. I watched the news clip silently from my office chair. The anchor said, Mitchell Corp faces internal conflict rumors. I muttered, karma works slowly, but never forgets. Victoria asked, does watching this hurt you? I said, it feels distant, like another life. My phone buzzed with Lauren's name flashing repeatedly. I answered and said, what do you want? She snapped, you enjoyed this humiliation, didn't you? I said, you taught me public lessons, remember? She said, Ryan is causing chaos, refusing authority. I replied, you chose him over stability. She said, I need you to talk sense. I laughed and said, I am not your tool. She said, you owe me after everything. I said, I paid with years already. She yelled, you are still mine legally. I said, the papers say otherwise. She went quiet, then said, please help me. I felt a twist of guilt inside briefly. Victoria listened nearby, without interrupting once. I said, Lauren, handle your own mess. She whispered, you changed since marrying her. I said, no, I finally stopped bending. She hung up, breathing hard, defeated. Later, a leaked audio played online unexpectedly. Ryan said, Lauren, relax, I run this now. Her voice sounded strained, saying, respect my position. Commentators laughed, dissecting power struggles publicly. I turned off the screen, feeling strange relief. Victoria said, you did nothing wrong. I said, relief feels wrong after loving her. She said, empathy does not require sacrifice. At a conference, Claire questioned my authority openly. I answered calmly and presented verified projections. Applause followed, surprising even me. Victoria stepped forward and said, he speaks for us. Cameras flashed, capturing her quiet support. I saw headlines later praising our unity. Lauren texted saying, you replace me easily. I replied, you replaced me first. She called, crying, saying, Ryan left during crisis. I said, I am sorry, but unavailable. She said, you promised forever once. I said, forever died at the gala. That night, I searched old boxes alone. I found my wedding ring taped inside. My hands shook, remembering promises whispered years ago. I whispered goodbye and dropped it trash. The sound felt final and clean somehow. Daniel visited and said, you look stronger. I said, strength came after breaking completely. He said, she is spiraling badly. I said, consequences arrive quietly sometimes. Lauren appeared outside the estate unexpectedly. She shouted, Ethan, talk to me now. I stepped out and said, say it quickly. She said, I made mistakes but loved you. I said, love does not humiliate publicly. She said, Ryan manipulated everything. I said, you allowed it proudly. She cried, saying, I feel unsafe alone. I said, safety was something I provided. She said, I lost my foundation. I said, you pushed it away willingly. Victoria joined us and said, leave our property. Lauren stared, shocked, realizing my new reality. She whispered, you chose her over me. I said, I chose myself finally. She looked at me like a stranger. I realized she lost more than marriage tonight. She said, my world is collapsing, Ethan, please stay. I said, you ignored my warnings and laughter. She said, I never thought you would leave. I said confidence grew when silence ended. She said Ryan cannot fix this alone. I said he was enough before remember. She said I feel exposed without you beside me. I said exposure teaches accountability, Lauren. She said you sound like her now. I said I learned strength watching Victoria. She flinched hearing that name spoken calmly. I said this conversation is over. She said will you ever forgive me? I said forgiveness does not mean return. She said I lost my safest place. I said safety was never guaranteed. She cried quietly, shoulders shaking, finally breaking. I felt sadness without responsibility at last. Victoria said go inside, Ethan. I nodded and said goodbye, Lauren. She whispered you were my foundation. I said foundations ignored will crumble. I walked back knowing my role ended. Inside I exhaled, feeling lighter and sad. Victoria asked, are you okay now? I said I finally am. She said karma finished its first lesson. I said I will keep learning. Silence settled, comfortable instead of painful. I knew Lauren understood what she lost. I stood taller knowing I would never kneel again. Power shifted quietly, without celebration or cruelty. I whispered goodbye to the man she controlled. The night felt calm, honest, and deserved. I turned off my phone, choosing peace. Tomorrow would arrive without her shadow finally. I smiled faintly, accepting loss, growth, and truth. My heart felt bruised, but no longer owned. I closed the door on the past. Freedom felt quiet, heavy, and real. Finally, I agreed to meet Lauren inside a quiet cafe. She sat trembling and said, thank you for coming. I replied, say what you need quickly. She whispered, I ruined everything, Ethan. I said, I already know that truth. She said, fear controlled me, success blinded me. I asked, did fear excuse cruelty? She shook her head and said no. She said I chose ego over love. I listened without interrupting or comforting her. She said Ryan left when scandals surfaced. I said he followed convenience like before. She cried, saying I deserve this downfall. I said accountability finally found you. She asked, do you hate me now? I said hate requires energy I saved. She said I miss how safe I felt. I said safety was something I gave freely. She said I treated you like insurance. I nodded and said policies expire. She reached for my hand and I pulled back. She said please help me fix this. I said fixing yourself is your work. She said I am scared alone. I said loneliness teaches reflection. She said you sound distant and cold. I said boundaries feel cold to violators. She cried harder, saying I loved you truly. I said love without respect destroys itself. She asked, is there any chance left? I said chances ended when trust died. Silence sat heavy between our breaths. She whispered, I finally see your worth. I said recognition after loss changes nothing. She asked, what do you want from me? I said peace and distance. She nodded, defeated, understanding too late. I stood and said, take care, Lauren. She watched me leave, eyes full regret. Outside, I breathed deeply, feeling strangely calm. That night, Victoria poured wine quietly beside me. She said, did you find closure? I said I chose boundaries instead. She said that choice takes strength. I said strength came after being broken. She hesitated, then said, I fear attachment. I looked at her and said, why? She said, emotions once cost me everything. I said, walls protect but also isolate. She said, I am learning to trust slowly. I said, I am here without pressure. She smiled faintly and said, that helps. Days later, headlines confirmed Lauren's resignation publicly. Ryan disappeared, avoiding accountability completely. I felt no joy, only acceptance. Victoria asked, does her regret matter? I said regret belongs to her journey. She said, I trust you, Ethan. I paused, surprised by her words. I said, trust feels earned, not demanded. She nodded and said, exactly. Lauren messaged saying, please meet again. I deleted it without reply. Victoria watched and said, you are done. I said, I am finally free. Lauren stood across the street later, watching me. I did not approach or wave back. She realized I would not return. I walked forward without looking behind. My past faded quietly behind my steps. I chose peace over saving her again. I told Victoria, I fear repeating old mistakes. She said fear means you learn something valuable. I asked what happens if feelings grow. She said then we face them honestly. I said honesty once destroyed my marriage. She said dishonesty destroyed it first. I considered that truth quietly. She said, I will not cage you. I said I will not disappear again. She said then we understand each other. Later Daniel called asking how I felt. I said lighter, but still bruised. He said healing is rarely comfortable. I said I chose dignity over rescue. He said I am proud of you. I thanked him and ended the call. That night, I slept without nightmares. Morning sunlight felt unfamiliar and calm. Lauren sent one final message apologizing fully. I read it slowly, without responding. I realized closure does not require conversation. At work, Victoria trusted my judgment publicly. I spoke confidently, without seeking approval. Colleagues listened differently than before. I felt present instead of invisible. Later, Victoria said you belong here. I said I am learning to believe that. She said take your time. Weeks passed without drama or chaos. Lauren's absence grew permanent and quiet. I stopped checking news about her failures. Peace replaced curiosity gradually. One evening I saw Lauren waiting again. She looked smaller than memory allowed. She whispered, Ethan, I am sorry. I said, I believe you now. She asked, can we talk someday? I said, someday will not be today. She nodded, tears falling freely. I turned and walked beside Victoria. Lauren remained behind, finally understanding. I did not look back again. I chose forward movement over history. My life continued without her weight. The regret belonged to her alone. I carried only lessons ahead. I sat at the conference table reviewing projections calmly. A director asked Ethan, what is your recommendation? I answered restructure logistics and cut vanity spending. Silence followed, then nods around the room. Victoria said proceed with his plan immediately. I felt something shift inside quietly. After the meeting, Daniel walked in smiling wide. He said, I hear you need strategy support. I said I need loyalty more than brilliance. He laughed and said, you finally learned. Victoria shook his hand and said, welcome aboard. Daniel said, I will not disappoint either of you. Claire confronted me later near the elevators. She said, impressive climb for a former nobody. I replied, underestimated people adapt faster. She smirked and said, enjoy it briefly. I said, threats sound weaker without leverage. At the next board vote, Claire pushed manipulation. I countered calmly, presenting data she missed. Victoria said facts beat ambition every time. The vote passed unanimously against Claire's proposal. Claire stormed out knowing her influence ended. Daniel whispered, you handled that beautifully. I said survival taught me precision. Victoria said leadership suits you naturally. I replied, I stopped doubting my worth. Later, Lauren's name appeared in a headline. I closed the article without reading details. Daniel noticed and said, you are done emotionally. I said peace requires selective attention. That evening, Victoria and I shared dinner quietly. She said, I see confidence, not fear now. I said confidence came from being trusted. She said trust must be protected carefully. I asked, do you still fear attachment? She paused and said, less than before. I said, honesty helped rebuild me. She said, you never demand anything. I said, I learned the cost of begging. She said, I respect that boundary. Daniel later announced a successful merger publicly. Applause filled the room unexpectedly. Victoria said Ethan led negotiations brilliantly. I felt seen without spotlight hunger. Claire resigned weeks later, citing personal reasons. I knew defeat hid behind polite wording. Victoria said power reveals character eventually. I said I learned that painfully. One afternoon, Henry Hale called me privately. He said, you earned your place properly. I replied, I intend to keep it. He said, do not waste this opportunity. I said I value it deeply. Daniel joked, saying, look at you respected. I smiled and said respect feels lighter. Victoria and I reviewed future expansion plans. She asked what direction excites you. I said, building something lasting ethically. She nodded and said, aligned values matter. I noticed she shared more openly now. She asked, do you regret this marriage? I answered, no, I chose growth consciously. She said, I never wanted control over you. I said, I finally feel equal. She smiled quietly, without deflection. News outlets praised our partnership synergy. I ignored titles, focusing on substance. Daniel said, you thrive under responsibility. I said, responsibility feels better than dependence. Victoria asked about my long-term vision. I said, I want purpose beyond survival. She said, you already achieved that. I said, then, I want fulfillment. She leaned back and studied me thoughtfully. She said, fulfillment requires risk. I said, I am learning courage slowly. She said, you are braver than you think. That night we walked the terrace together. She said, you changed this company. I said, you changed my trajectory. She said, we changed each other. I paused, letting that settle quietly. Daniel later toasted to earn success. I raised my glass without hesitation. I realized fear no longer dictated choices. Victoria watched me and said, you seem settled. I said, I feel grounded for once. She said, then answer honestly. She asked, what do you want, Ethan? Not what you owe. I sat across from Victoria and said, we need to talk honestly. She nodded and said, the contract no longer fits us. I said, I agree, obligations hide real intentions. She said, then let's end it properly. I slid the contract forward and said, no more rules. She tore it calmly and said, honesty replaces control. I felt relief, mixed with fear rising slowly. I said, I am afraid of loving again. She said, fear means you value what is possible. I said, love once cost me my dignity. She said, love should never demand surrender. I watched her closely and said, I trust you. She said, trust grows when respect stays intact. We spoke quietly without tension or expectation. Days later, Lauren called requesting a public apology. I said, do what you need for closure. She stood before cameras saying, I failed my husband. I watched without anger or satisfaction. Reporters asked if I accepted her apology. I said, forgiveness is personal, not performative. Lauren's face fell, realizing nothing changed. Later, I met my lawyer signing final papers. He said, these terms protect your future fully. I signed, calmly feeling weight lift inside. Victoria waited outside and asked, are you okay? I said, I feel complete finally. She said, closure suits you. I said, forgiveness freed me, not her. That night we shared dinner quietly again. She asked, what do you feel now? I said, peace, without emptiness. She said, that is rare. I said, dignity feels better than passion alone. She smiled and said, I admire your clarity. Lauren messaged, once more saying, I miss you. I replied, I wish you healing. I did not feel pulled backward. Victoria noticed and said, you are steady now. I said, healing does not require distance always. She said, it requires honesty always. I asked, what do you want from us? She said, mutual choice, not obligation. I said, then I choose you freely. She paused, then said, I choose you too. There was no rush or dramatic gesture. We moved slowly, respecting each other's scars. I realized love can be quiet, strong. At work, colleagues treated me as equal. Daniel joked, saying, look at you, balanced. I said, balance came after loss. Victoria and I discussed future without pressure. She said, we will grow at our pace. I said that pace feels safe. Lauren's name faded from daily thought. I stopped measuring my worth by past wounds. Victoria asked, do you regret anything? I said, I regret begging once. She said, you will never beg here. I believed her without fear. Weeks later, I stood before a mirror alone. I saw strength without bitterness reflected back. I remembered loving without boundaries before. I whispered, never again. Victoria joined me and said, you look peaceful. I said, I finally am. She asked, what did you learn? I said, love should not cost dignity. She nodded and said, then we are aligned. I held her hand gently without urgency. I knew this bond was chosen. The past no longer demanded repayment. The future felt open and honest. I stepped forward, carrying only lessons. I stood by the window and watched morning light settle. Victoria asked, what are you thinking about now? I said, I am thinking about who I became. She said, growth often arrives quietly. I said, betrayal forced me to listen. She said, pain sharpens perspective. I said, Lauren feels distant like a lesson. She said, distance proves healing. I said, Ryan no longer matters at all. She said, irrelevance is final defeat. I smiled and said, I feel no anger. She said, peace replaces revenge naturally. Daniel called and said, proud suits you. I said, survival turned into strength. He said, you earned every inch. I thanked him and ended the call. Victoria joined me and said, you are steady. I said, I stopped chasing approval. She said, validation fades, but self-respect remains. I said, I finally choose myself. She said, that choice defines everything. I remembered nights begging for attention. I remembered shrinking to keep someone comfortable. I said, I will never do that again. She said, neither will I. We stood together without hierarchy or fear. Lauren's name appeared briefly in news later. I scrolled past without reaction. Victoria noticed and said, you are free. I said, freedom feels ordinary now. She said, that means it is real. I asked, do you ever regret us? She said, no, because choice remains mutual. I said, that matters more than passion. She said, respect sustains love longer. I nodded, understanding deeply now. At work I spoke with confidence. People listened without questioning my place. I felt equal, not borrowed. Victoria said, your voice changed everything. I said, it was always here, muted. She said, betrayal unlocked it. I said, pain refined me, not ruined. Daniel joked, you are untouchable now. I said, untouchable means boundaries honored. He said, that is power. I walked through the office calm, focused. I felt no need to prove myself. Victoria asked, what do you want next? I said, meaning, not applause. She said, then we align. I looked at her and said, thank you. She said, for what exactly? I said, for standing beside me. She said, never above, never below. I smiled, feeling understood. I reflected on my past marriage quietly. I saw where I ignored warning signs. I saw where I surrendered dignity. I forgave myself fully. Victoria asked, do you miss anything? I said, I miss who I was. She said, he taught you well. I said, yes, he did. Lauren's consequences were not my concern. Ryan vanished into irrelevance, deservedly. My life moved forward without ghosts. I felt whole without reclaiming the past. Victoria said, you seem complete. I said, completion feels calm. She said, calm is strength. I believed that now. I no longer chased love desperately. I allowed it to meet me equally. I chose patience over fear. I chose dignity over attachment. Victoria reached for my hand gently. I held it without urgency. I said, this feels right. She said, because it is chosen freely. I realized revenge was unnecessary. Growth was the real justice. I looked back, once mentally. I closed that chapter firmly. I faced forward without hesitation. I knew betrayal shaped but never defined me. I became the man I needed.